Well, hello everyone, it's Pete here, and look what I've got. It's a lovely Tamiya squash fan. This kit was gifted to me by Peter Smith of CW01 Creations, so a big thank you goes out to him. What everyone's been asking me is how did I get from that box of bits that I showed in the other video to this lovely model? Well, I will show you. And then they said, can you do it in less than 20 minutes because we've got very short attention spans? I said, yeah, alright. And then they said, can you do it in a reassuring Brummy accent, because that's what we like on a Tamiya build. Alright, I'll have a go. Hi everyone, it's Pete here again. Got this really amazing kit, the Tamiya squash fan. It's absolutely completely great. Yeah, I'm not sure I can keep that up. You might have to put up with my boring South of England accent. I'm going to be building this with the rear steer option, and the parts I've added to the kit are a full bearing set, a 20-tooth steel pinion, 2 servos, a cuddly toy, a brushless set, a receiver, a set of steak knives in a presentation box, a servo splitter cable, CVA shocks, and these springs that are softer than the standard kit springs, and also various tins of Lexan spray paint that I had left over from previous builds. So let's get on with it. Step 1 is charging the battery, so I'll ignore that for now. Step 2 is putting together the 2 differentials. I'm going to be using Tamiya AW grease for this, which is quite a sticky grease, because in the past I found that these types of trucks work better with slightly sticky diffs. So I'm making sure to get grease on absolutely everything. Apart from that, it's a very straightforward step. So that's one done, I'll just do another one the same. I'm just using these gearbox joints to make sure the grease is spread evenly throughout the diffs. As before step 3, I'm just getting rid of the excess plastic on these chassis halves. It's really hard plastic this, and it's sort of difficult to do this. You need some decent side cuts and probably a knife just to tidy up. I'm trying very hard not to cut my fingers off. So step 3 is just putting the bearings and diffs in, and there's also a little bit of excess plastic to take out. It's a bit fiddly this, I'm just using the side cutters and knife again. As previously mentioned, I'm using ball bearings on this kit. I'd always recommend it, but especially on this, because you don't really want to have to take this gearbox apart too often. I'm just going to use the ceramic grease from the kit for this. And that's step 3 done. Step 4 is just putting the bearings or bushings into the ends of the gears. Very straightforward. Step 5 is putting the gears into the gearbox half using these shafts. Just need to get the right length shaft in the right hole. Now that was all well and good, but I probably should have put grease on the gears before I put them in there. So that's the first 4, and then there's another 6 to go in. Quick test, although the diff gears aren't really in the right place until the gearbox joints go in later. Step 6 is possibly the shortest step in history. You just put in 2 bearings in the other half of the gearbox. Step 7 is putting the 2 halves of the gearbox together. First of all, I'm just going to put some grease around the edges to help stop dust going in. Then it's just a matter of putting the 2 halves together, and then there are 10 screws to go in. One top tip is to attach a magnet to your screwdriver so the screws stick to it. Step 8 is putting the pinion on the motor. I've got my upgraded part, which is a steel 20-tooth pinion. I'm also using this Absima thrust brushless motor in place of the brushed motor in the kit. A bit of thread lock on the pinion grub screw should make sure it doesn't shake loose. There's always this little circle thing in Tamiya kits, which I think is to guard the plastic against heat from the motor, but it's a bit tricky with the brushless motor because it hasn't got a bump like the brushed one has. But it is possible to do, which I'll show you in a bit. So the top of the pinion needs to be 14mm away from the top of the motor. Step 9 is installing the motor and one of the bumper mounts. With the motor screws, you need to make sure you use the right holes for the pinion that you're using. To get the motor plate central, I'm going to put it on the screws here and then push the pinion through. It's just about fits on this one. I'm also making sure the wires point upwards out of the way. Step 10 is putting in the motor guard. Step 11 is putting together the front lower arms. There are little marks on one side of both pieces to make sure you put them together the right way. So you make 2 the same. Also in this step we're putting these black O-rings into the drive cups. So you can use the dog bone to help you put it in, and also I was using a screwdriver to help seat it properly. Step 12 is attaching the front arms and gearbox joints to the chassis. The lower arms are held on with this U-shaped shaft. Now the upper arms are held on with these step screws, and my top tip is to get yourself some 3mm washers, so then you can fully tighten the screws and the arms won't bind. I also put a little touch of super glue on the threads because I know from experience that these can shake loose. The gearbox joints push in both sides, and that's that step done. Step 13 is assembling the front uprights. It's the same parts on both sides, but you need to assemble them so that they're mirror images of each other. For my American viewers, that's a mirror image. There's no real top tips for this step, but just really look at the picture to see which way up everything is. Again, I'm using ball bearings rather than the bushings on this step. You can use the axle to pull them through and seat them properly. So that's one done. Just make sure the steering moves freely, and like I was saying, build the other one so it's a mirror image of the first one. Step 14 is putting in the drive shafts and attaching the front uprights. Be aware there are black and silver drive shafts in the kit, and these are the black ones. Again, I've added washers to the step screws and I'm using a bit of super glue. I think it's easiest to attach the top arm and then put the drive shaft into the axle end and then move it around to push the other end in the gearbox. Check it's all moving freely, and that's that step done. Now step 15 is putting on the rear upper arms and bumper mount. Now I started doing this forgetting that I was going to do the rear steer option, so there are actually different parts needed here if you're doing the rear steer. So I'll do step 16 and 17 of the standard build before remembering about the rear steer option. So at this point I remember the additional instructions in the back. You have to use a bit of common sense really about when you look in the back of the manual and when you look at the main part of the instructions. What I would say, regardless of which option you're doing, is really have a look at the parts, because there's a lot of parts that look very similar but they're not quite the same, especially the upper arms that are fairly similar but different lengths. So these are now the upper and lower arms for the rear steer option. So the steering parts on the back are very similar to the ones on the front. Now something that I got wrong initially is that if you're doing the standard build you need the silver drive shaft, and if you're doing the rear steer you need the black drive shaft. So like I say, this is all pretty similar to the front of the car. I do make a mistake here and use the silver drive shafts, which I'll go back and rectify later. So after a combination of steps from the main part of the manual and the bit in the back, then that's all done. So we're back in the main part of the manual on step 19, which is building up the dampers. So they give you these friction dampers that have got a bit of rubber tube in that give a bit of damping. I'm actually going to be using oil shocks, but I'm building one up just to check the size of it. I think these friction dampers with the tube inside are better than the ones that Tamiya sell without the tube inside that are like pogo sticks. But having said that, oil shocks are always going to be better. So I'm just checking the length of the shock so I can make the oil shocks the same length. It's about 63mm between hole centres. So that's the standard one done. Now I'm going to get on with the Tamiya CVA oil dampers. This is the mini shock set, which comes without springs, but I bought these softer springs separately. I found in the past they used to be good for this type of kit. I think the standard kit springs are a bit too firm. So with these CVA shocks, there's various ways you can put them together to get different lengths and also different amounts of damping. So there's a bit of trial and error involved in getting these shocks right for this truck. I do end up changing them a bit, and I'll show you at the end what I've done. So to start with, I used the piston with 2 holes. Also I'm just using the oil that came with them, which is quite a soft oil. I'm using both spaces inside to reduce the travel on this a bit. So I'm using the longer of the 2 rod ends for this. So if you look at it compared with the kit spring, it's just a little bit shorter. So just a matter of making another 3 the same, and that's that done. Step 20 is attaching the front dampers. Now instead of using these step screws from the standard build, I'm going to use these ball connectors. I do eventually change this a bit, and I'll show you at the end what I've done. Now the advantage of using ball connectors is that you can pop the shocks on and off more easily. Also there's less play than there is using the step screws. Step 21 is attaching the rear dampers, which is the same procedure. There is a slight difference if you're doing the rear steer like I am. It's just that there's fewer holes in the rear arm, but it's still the inside hole that you need to use. Step 22 is attaching the front and rear bumpers. This is another thing I end up changing, and I'll show you at the end what I've done. Step 23 is putting together the steering linkage. So you've got to put the ends on these rods to make them the same length as in the picture. Then you need to put various ball connectors and bearings into this steering pivot. You just need to push the rods onto the balls, just make sure you get the right length rod on the right balls. I'm using bearings here rather than the kit bushings. Step 24 is attaching the steering linkage to the chassis. You just need to make sure you get this in the right way and with the arms on the right sides of the chassis. You need to put this little bar through the middle of the bearing and then find something to poke it in with. This screw then goes across to stop it falling out. The rod ends then snap onto the ball connectors on the uprights. If you're just doing two-wheel steer, you need to put the little bar in the back there, but if you're doing the four-wheel steer, then you need to look in the back of the manual to do the rear steer linkage. So this is all fairly similar to the front steering. Again, you're putting ball connectors into a steering pivot. You need to make sure you get the balls in the right hole. Again, this is very similar to the front one, just make sure it's the right way up with the arms on the right side of the car. So we're back in the main instructions on step 25. In this step you set up your radio gear so you can centralise the servos, and also you put on the servo horn. I've got two servos because of the rear steer. I'm using a Y-splitter cable and I'm going to run them from the same port of the receiver. Just going to check they both work, and then I'm going to turn the power off when they're in the neutral position. Then the servo saver goes together and it goes on the servo at the angle that shows in the picture. You need to use the right screw for the servo you're using, because this is a Metal Gear servo, it uses a 3mm machine screw. Then for the rear steer it's into the back of the manual again, so there's a slightly different servo saver on the back. With the power on, I'm just testing that the servo savers spring back to the centre properly. Next there's some little brackets that go onto the servo. Next I'm attaching the rear servo to the chassis. Then you attach the rod end to the ball connector on the servo saver. Then it's back to the main part of the manual to do a very similar thing at the front. So a quick test and it all seems to be working okay. Now because both servos are running off the same port of the receiver, I need to make any little adjustments manually by changing the lengths of the rods. I'm just trying to get the front and back to be centred. Step 27 is attaching the electronics to the chassis. Now this depends a bit on what electronics you're using, but I'm going with the ESC in front and the receiver behind. Step 28 is tidying up the wires with cable ties. Also what I'm going to do is use a cable tie to strap down the ESC. Double-sided tape's alright, but it's much more secure with a cable tie. This is also a good opportunity to double check everything works before I strap all the cables down. The side rails on the chassis are pretty useful for strapping the wires to, but you just need to make sure you can still get the battery in and out. Step 29 is putting foam strips on the battery door and inside the battery compartment. Making sure the battery does fit in. Step 30 is attaching the body posts. So I can cut these to size later when I've done the body. Step 31 is putting the tyres on the wheels. It does say not to glue them, but from previous experience I disagree. You need to look at the diagram to check that you've got the wheels and the tyres going in the right direction. Step 32 is attaching a body post brace on the front and also attaching the front wheels. This is the usual Tamiya thing where the bearing goes in and there's a little bar that goes across and the hex goes on top of that. So that's the wheels on. So I'm just going to guess a height for this body post brace and I can adjust it when I get the body on. Step 33 is the same but at the back of the car. So that's pretty much done, but I've realised that I've forgotten to attach the aerial holder in a previous step. Now it's time to make Mark Bryan sad by cutting down the wibbly wobbly, and that's it, job done. Step 34 is putting in the battery and I can double check everything's working. That all seems good, and then step 35 onwards is all to do with getting the body shell done. First of all I cut the body out, then I washed it out with washing up liquid and a scouring sponge, being careful not to scour the windows. Next I've masked up the roof, the front windows and the bumpers. Then I've got various paints that have got less than a half left in them, so I'm going to use a series of blues and see what happens. There's also a purple in there. Now I have messed up with body shell painting before, so I think it's good to make a little plan, and here's mine. So this is after the first 3 types of blue. So like I say, I'm just using up paint, it didn't really need all these different colours. One top tip is to put your tins of paint in a cup of hot water before you use them. Makes them spray better. Mr. Ritchie agrees. Then I put a layer of purple on, which probably makes no difference after all the blue layers. I've taken off the bumper masking and then I'm going to put a few layers of silver on. Next I've taken off the roof masking and I'm going to put a few layers of white on. After the white I put a bit more silver and then black. Next I took off the window mask and did a couple of layers of smoke. Then it's time to take off the overspray film and do the big reveal. So yeah, it looks pretty good to me. Not quite perfect between the blue and the white, but they do give you some white stickers to help give you a sharp line. Next I put quite a lot of Gorilla Tape underneath to strengthen it, because I do intend to knock this around. Next it's time for the stickers. So I'm going to do the usual thing of cutting it out as close as I can to the lines and then taking away a bit of the backing paper till I got the position on the car. Then you can take the rest of the backing paper off, or sections of the backing paper off, until it's in position. So that's that one. I'm not going to do these all on camera, but I'll just do this one on the side. I'm just going box art with the stickers because I've got absolutely no imagination. Giving these a quick blast with a hairdryer is a pretty good idea to make sure they're stuck. So I've just done that for all the stickers and it's ended up like this. I have to say I'm pretty happy with that. I'd already done the bumpers with silver paint, so I didn't need to use the stickers for those. So it's time to put it on the chassis and admire the finished result. So yes, really happy with that. Very distinctly Tamiya, which is why I wanted this kit. So just testing the suspension and it's pretty good, but a little bit bouncy, and I do tune this later, which I'll get onto. So that's as much as I can do in the hobby room. It's time to take it out for a proper blast. Okay, so if you watch my channel you might have seen this footage before. As you can see, this is loads of fun. Like I was saying, very typically Tamiya. You might notice in this video it's got a lunchbox bumper on it now. I'll put a link to a video that explains how you can do that mod. Now I thought I'd give the rear steer option a try, and I was thinking it would make this tip over far too much, but as it turns out it makes it a huge amount of fun, and also different to other RC cars that I've got. It is a bit similar to the rear steer on the Kong head, but that's a 6-wheel drive. Now I did test the speed of this on tarmac and it's 22 miles per hour, so considering that's with the brushless set and a 22th pinion, I think it's going to be fairly slow with a standard build. So yes, most enjoyable indeed. Now it's back to me in the hobby room to explain the changes I've made to this since I built it. So yeah, a few test drives in with this one, and I've made a few more little changes. Okay, so first up I was talking about the lunchbox bumper. Basically you need this part, which you should have if you've done a Wild Willy kit. You can obviously get it separately. I'll put a link into the video where I explain how to do that. And also put the wheelie bar on this, which is again from Wild Willy and various other kits. This one doesn't necessarily do wheelies, but this just comes out the back of the car a bit more, gives a bit more protection to the body, although the body is about here, but it only squashes in a bit before it hits that, so I think it gives a little bit more protection. Now one of the main things that I've been tweaking on this is the suspension. If you can notice, the top of the suspension there. Before I had the ball connectors there, and I'd actually shear the thread on one of those. So what I've done is to drill all the way through and then put a screw with a nut on the back there, which makes the whole thing a lot stronger. And then you get that little collar piece that you get with the oil shock set, so it makes taking the shock off a bit more difficult, but it also is much stronger in terms of putting strain on this particular piece of the chassis, because you don't want to break that, because if that breaks you need a whole new chassis, which wouldn't be good. I've done something similar to that on the Kong head. So in terms of the shock, I did actually take the smaller spacer out of this to give it a bit more travel. I was trying to keep it quite low because I was worried about it falling over too much, but there wasn't quite enough travel, so got a little bit more travel there. You notice I put the longer rod end on there, and you might think, well, don't put any spacers in, put the short rod end on, but then the spring cup thing there does tend to touch on this bit of the arms I found on other kits similar to this. So that's the setup I've ended up with. It's actually quite a thick oil in the end. I think it's like a 4000 CST or something like that. I don't think it's over damped, but in terms of making it land, that seems to be best. You might notice on the video it does bounce a bit, and that's before I did that. So I think I've got the suspension about as good as I can get it, given the the small shocks and everything. So also the builder's talking about the tyres and the fact they say don't glue them on. I suppose the advantage is if they get full of sand, you just take them off and get the sand out. But I was finding with my Blackfoot the tyres are actually coming off, so you do need to glue them. What I've done actually is to cover over the vent holes in the wheels, and I've actually put vent holes in the tyres, which is something you tend to do on chunky RC cars. The theory being that if water goes in, you can spin it out, whereas if the holes are in the wheel, then the water stays within there and the dirt and everything. And that does seem to be effective, so at the end of the run you can come back and hold it up and spin the tyres and get all the rubbish out of them. So that's been quite good. Like I was saying before, I definitely recommend the rear steer. Some people are saying it's sort of easier to drive with only two-wheel steer, but I think if you've got an option that's different to other RC kits, then you should go for it, and it actually works really well, and it makes it good fun. And also if you've got a limited space and maybe only the standard motor, it'd be fun just sort of weave in and out of obstacles like in your garden or whatever. So I would definitely do that, because they give you all the bits. You only need an extra servo and you're away. So yeah, I'm glad I did do that option. So would I recommend this? Yeah, I definitely would. Now, like I was saying, I was kindly gifted this kit, but if you're not so fortunate, then you've got the kit to buy and that list of items that I mentioned at the beginning. So you're in for quite a few quid really to get this finished. You didn't really need the cuddly toy and a set of steak knives. That's a reference that only British people of a certain age will get. But yeah, apart from the fact that Tamiya kits are getting a bit expensive, definitely a great experience to build these up, and always good fun. And I say I especially wanted this one because it does look like an old school Tamiya. So if you made it this far, thank you ever so much for watching. Please press like and maybe leave me a comment, and I'll see you next time.